Okay, we should be good.
Thank you. Welcome everyone to our December 16, 2020 special City Council meeting. It is now 12:04 p.m. I'm grateful for staff and council to be meeting at a special time this month as we have some very exciting business to do today. We have appointments and we have the conversation of water. So very grateful to all of us coming together to meet today. Consistent with the provisions of the Utah Open and Public Meetings Act, we are convening this meeting electronically per code. And we will go ahead and get started. Council, just as a heads up, there's a series of confirmations. I'll read the confirmation, the agenda item with the name, but please do, after motion and second, if there's comments or questions, we can address those at that time if that structure sounds good, and we'll get started. So item number 2, confirmation of mayoral appointment of John Knight to the Moab City Planning Commission with the term ending December 31st, 2024. Is there a motion?
I will move.
Thank you, Mike. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Thank you, Ronnie. Discussion. I just wanted to share with all of you that John is being appointed to a 3-year full term. He is a business owner in Moab. He also has worked in the solar power industry for years as a project manager. I think most of us do know him, but he's also done projects in Moab in real estate. So I think that he will definitely serve as both a in business and in the with knowledge of property for the Planning Commission, and that's why I'm bringing him for appointment as a new member. Any questions or comments about John from the council? Okay, seeing none, I will roll call vote. Kaylin.
Aye.
Ronnie.
Aye.
Mike.
Aye.
Thank you. Motion passes 3-0. Sorry, point of order to myself. I just realized we did not do a roll call vote, which is why we only have 3 council members voting. So sorry for being out of order. Summer, will you take us through a roll call, not a roll call vote, a roll call in attendance? My apologies.
No problem. We have Mayor Emily Niehaus. We have Kaylin Jones, Moab City Council, Mike Duncan, Moab City Council, Ronnie Dressery, Moab City Council, Lori Simonson, City Attorney, Carly Castle, Assistant City Manager, Chuck Williams, City Engineer, Joel Linares, City Manager, Levi Jones, Public Works Director, and Mark Jolisant, Assistant City Engineer.
Summer, thank you so much. And I just wanted to make a note that both council members, Tawny and Karen, are unable to meet with us today at this special meeting and have noticed me as the chair of their not being able to meet. Sorry for being out of order. We're going to meet in person someday here soon, and we'll get back to business as new normal. Okay, agenda item number 3, confirmation of mayoral reappointment of Mary Ann Becknell to the Moab City Planning Commission with a term ending December 31st, 2024. Is there a motion?
Move to confirm.
Thank you, Ronnie. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Kaylin. Discussion? Mary Ann has been serving, and it was, I did speak with Kaya. She's very much in favor of this continued service. I will call for the vote. Ronnie.
Aye.
Mike.
Aye.
Kaylin.
Aye.
Motion passes 3-0. 4, confirmation of mayoral appointment of Becky Wells to the Moab City Planning Commission with a term ending December 31st, 2024. Is there a motion?
I will so move.
Thank you, Mike.
Second.
Thank you, Kaylin. Discussion. I just want to say that Becky was a bit hesitant to continue on the Planning Commission. We talked quite a bit. She definitely encouraged me to look for, as we're moving into appointments and reappointments, finding a builder to, or somebody with just a little more development experience And so she is agreeing to stay on the Planning Commission because she certainly has that experience in her wheelhouse. So I said, well, don't leave us in the lurch here. But also I did make a commitment to her that moving forward after today, that would be a focus for appointments, as long as I have the ability to do that appointment. So I just wanted to share that, and so that we can all stick me to my commitment of getting builder experience on our Planning Commission. Any discussion from all of you? Seeing none, I will call for the vote. Kaylin.
Aye.
Ronnie.
Aye, sorry.
Mike.
Aye.
Motion passes 3-0. Number 5, confirmation of removing Brian Ballard from the Moab City Planning Commission. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Thank you, Kaylin. Is there a second?
I will second. Yeah.
Thank you, Ronnie. Should beat you to it. Discussion. I do want to let you know that I think Brian served well as a Planning Commission member. I think in this era of COVID, it was very complicated. He struggled with participating, but he also struggled to communicate whether or not he would in fact be participating. There is no bad blood. There is just moving on. And that is what, and the reason for this removal is so that we can formally approve an appointment of somebody in his term. So that's what we're doing here, in case there was any concern or confusion that there might be bad blood in this scenario. Yes, Ronnie.
Mayor, just to confirm for people who might have read the packet and not been clear. So mainly he just wasn't able to make the minimum commitment to attend meetings, right?
That's correct.
Okay, thanks.
That's correct. And I want to say too, that was a commitment that I made at the beginning of my term, that we were going to hold commission members accountable for attendance. And there is some flexibility with respect to excused absence, meaning if somebody has a life event where it'll take them temporarily out of commission for just a moment in time. But there was that was not the case for this. So we are where we are. Any other discussion? Okay, I'll call for the vote. Mike.
Aye.
Kaylin.
Aye.
Ronnie.
Aye.
Motion passes 3-0. Item 6, confirmation of mayoral reappointment of Jessica O'Leary to the Moab City Planning Commission for a fill-in term ending December 31st, 2021. Is there a motion?
Move to confirm.
Thank you, Ronnie. Is there a second?
I will second.
Thank you, Mike. Discussion. I just want to say Jess has also been a great Planning Commission member. As you may recall, she is dabbling in other political thoughts and ran against Carl Albrecht for the House legislature. In conversation, because we wanted to create a full term for John Knight, and because she was appointed in a partial term, this reappointment of she'll essentially be replacing Brian Ballard and completing that term. And at the end of this year, if she wants to reapply for Planning Commission, great. Or if she finds other political aspirations, that's available to her as well, then she would term out for the year. So that is how Kaya, the chair, and I decided to move members so that we could give John a full term. And in case there was any question about her term ending just at the end of next year. Any discussion? Okay, I'll call for the vote. Kaylin.
Aye.
Ronnie.
Aye.
Mike.
Aye.
Motion passes 3-0. 7, confirmation of mayoral reappointment of Chase Golson to the Moab Mosquito Abatement District Board for a term ending December 31st, 2024. Is there a motion?
Move to approve.
Thank you, Kaylin. Second.
I'll second.
Thank you, Ronnie. Just briefly, he would like to continue this service, and we are saying thank you, thank you, thank you. Because while 2020 we did not have mosquito gate, we certainly did have quite a mosquito situation in 2019, and it is my sincere appreciation to him for getting through that complicated mosquito abatement history, and very grateful to him now for continuing to be willing to serve. So any discussion from all of you? Okay, I'll call for the vote. Ronnie?
Aye.
Mike?
Aye.
Kaylin?
Aye.
Motion passes 3-0, and we are through our confirmation votes. Thank you all for going so quickly. 15 minutes, not bad. We are now in section 8, water resources discussion. And I'll pass this time over to staff. I believe Chuck.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I've got a PowerPoint that I'd like to utilize to go through the discussion this afternoon. So let me share my screen. This takes just a second. Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yep, we can see it. Thanks, Chuck.
Slideshow. So I thought the mayor originally asked us to try and put together the number when we were talking about, because there's been a lot of work that's been going on in terms of what water availability is. And over the last 6 weeks, as we talked about it, I don't think we're ready to say what the number is, but I've certainly tried to pull together the range of numbers for today's discussion as we get there, as well as talk about some of the other elements of water resources, and working with Carly and Joel on this, and Mark from my office. So I'd like to say that from my perspective, the presentation purpose is to update council on the overall status of water resources in the Moab Spanish Valley regarding the recent scientific reports regarding the availability of water quantity, and we'll talk in more detail about those, obviously. Potential future water conservation measures, and Carly's going to lead the discussion on that, and schedule of upcoming system improvement investments, because we have new information, but we've got a system that we're cranking along. As you know, Levi's leading that charge, and we're trying to assist him in doing that, and we'll talk some about that. So from my perspective, that's what I'll try and talk about today. Quick overview, you've seen most of this before, but for the public, currently our active sources for availability of water is we use 4 springs and 3 wells. 2 of those wells are culinary. One is currently utilized for irrigation, well number 7. We have 3 1 million gallon storage tanks, about 48 linear miles of pipes that's greater than 4 inches for our distribution system. Typically today we put in 8-inch pipes. So the fact that we even have 6-inch pipes and 4-inch pipes, we're undersized, if you will, in parts of the city. Our source protection areas, and those source protection areas are areas that are delineated by the city and approved by the state for our spring protection areas, as well as our well protection areas. And there are best management practices that should be implemented within those protection areas. And we just recently, based on Dr. KOLM's work, expanded those, submitted new source protection areas to the state, and it expanded them. We went from something like 24 square miles to 34.8 square miles. And our follow-up to that will be to communicate to those folks who live within those areas, what the best management practices are. As an example, Lions Back is in our spring protection area, and they have a fairly rigorous, because it's a new development, system of best management practices that they'll do in order to protect our springs as well as our wells. So that's part of it, not just maintaining the system. We want to protect our sources as well from potential contamination. Our total water use in a given year, and it fluctuates. That's why I'm giving you a range here. We track it annually. It's between 1,800 and 2,400 acre feet per year, and I've got a graphic here about what an acre foot is. Connections, I found this number always interesting. About 1,746 residential connections and 562 commercial, which is about 25% of our connections are commercial connections. So in 2019, we had 2,308 connections in a city with a population of about 5,200 people.
Got a question for you, if I may.
Yes.
Connections, is that in units of pipe, so to speak, or is it in units of ERC, more like a water quantity?
It's actual physical connection, Mike.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Like a meter. We have 2,308 meters. Is that a safe?
Yeah, so that's a good way to look at it. The number might vary just a little bit, but that's a good way to look at it too. Yep. Some of the known issues which we're addressing, and thanks to council for updating the water rates earlier in the summer, which allows us to be proactive in this, and I'll talk more about it as a city. Inadequate fire suppression in places. We have failing pipes, as you've heard me say before, but it's true. We have World War II era pipes, which, believe it or not, is older than me even. And those pipes, they last till they don't. And then we have low circulation in the system extremities. Currently, the budget source for all of our water work is done through the Water Enterprise Fund, which is, as you know, a separate fund from the general fund and from the Wastewater Enterprise Fund. And this year's budget is about $1.26 million. So just thought it was worthwhile to kind of do that quick overview of the system. Now, as we get closer to talking more about those reports, those recent reports, I wanted to take a second and talk about what is hydrology. And I think it's a nice definition from the USGS, and I'll just read some of it. Hydrology is the science that encompasses the occurrence, distribution, movement, and properties of the waters of the earth and their relationship with the environment within each phase of the hydrologic cycle. And then the cycle is a continuous process by which water is purified by evaporation and transported from the Earth's surface to the atmosphere and back to the land and ocean. So really, water is a cycle. It typically doesn't go away. It's always of interest where it is within that cycle. And the other thing that I wanted to point out that I liked about this definition, all of the physical, chemical, and biological processes involved in water, over and beneath the Earth's surface and through growing plants, are of interest to those who study the hydrologic cycle. And the reports we're going to talk about in a little bit, various reports took various approaches to the physical elements or the chemical elements or the biological processes, including the growing plants, more so than some of the other reports. And I think at the end, it's a good overall evaluation from the various reports cumulatively. Some definitions, not to practice Lori's trade, but this is directly from Utah Code, and we'll be hearing more about it after the adjudication is done, is if indeed DWR moves into a groundwater management plan in the next couple of years, which there's a discussion that that's going to happen, and then my estimate it probably will happen, but they'll be very interested in safe yield. Safe yield is a Utah term. It's used in other places, but it's very specific to Utah. It's the amount of groundwater that can be withdrawn from a groundwater basin over a period of time without exceeding the long-term recharge of the basin. And then, of course, then they add on unreasonably affecting the basin's physical and chemical integrity. But from a numbers standpoint, what that essentially says is that you can withdraw as much as you're recharging, and you've not exceeded safe yield. So if you're taking more water out than you're recharging, you're exceeding safe yield, and the state will probably step in and want to do a groundwater management plan to address that issue. And the other thing that we hear a lot about in this business is water rights. And a water right is a right to divert or remove from its natural source and beneficially use water. You know, the concept of water rights came about as the West, you know, was settled by Europeans and Americans as we moved across the country. And it's been around. Moab has water rights. Moab Irrigation has water rights. GWISA has water rights. Private citizens have water rights. And it's specific to a right to divert. So the point of diversion is something that's talked about in water rights quite often. Utah has a division of water rights. And generally speaking, older rights have higher priority, or first in time, first in right. So water rights are a paper certificate that's based upon physical water, at least at some snapshot in time, that was diverted from a specific location. As an example, we have wells and springs, and our water rights reflect back on those wells and springs for the city of Moab as a municipal user. I know Mike's going to have this in his presentation later, Mike, but I thought it was such a good slide I put it in, and didn't mean to steal your thunder on this one, but it's a good, what is an acre foot? An acre foot is 325,851 gallons. So it's a measurement of volume. Basically it's 1 acre that's a foot deep. So, you know, 272 feet by 160 feet, a football field is 300 feet by 150 feet. So you think of it as close to the football field. And to bring it into perspective locally, Ken's Lake, when full, holds approximately 3,000 acre feet. So at that snapshot in time, when Ken's Lake is full, it's not releasing, and there's not any more water coming in, that bathtub holds about 3,000 acre feet of water. This is a nice graphic that I think that the DWR generated and was kind enough to let us use this. I just think it's good to kind of give a perspective. So here is Moab, downtown Moab, down here in the valley floor. Colorado River down here on the bottom. Highway 128 moving up River Road parallel. Castle Valley out there. The red line represents a watershed divide. So the drop of water that falls right here, it goes this way, goes down into the Grandstaff system, doesn't go into our system, our Glen Canyon or Pat Creek system. Drop of water that falls here on this side of the red line, goes into the North Fork, follows down, joins Mill Creek, then winds its way ultimately to the river through either the creek or through the wetlands, or some of it into the springs that are irrigation lines that move along here. But at the top is the LaSalle Mountains. This is the red line that this drop of water that falls on this side of the red line heads this way. Drop of water that falls on the other side heads towards Colorado. Yeah, and another more circuitous route. Here's Ken's Lake. Of course, Ken's Lake is supplied by the Sheely Diversion, which takes water out of Mill Creek through the tunnel in the mountain and comes down through Faux Falls, fills up Ken's Lake. Spanish Valley, the rim is again as a watershed boundary with a waterfall into Pat Creek. This waterfall directly towards the Colorado River. San Juan County and Grand County line, you know, so our valley, our watershed valley has at least 3 political jurisdictions, being San Juan County, Grand County, and the city of Moab within it. And of course, there are special districts, Grand Water Sewer Service Agency, and others, Moab Irrigation. So there are political issues as well as physical, quantitative, and qualitative issues that are addressed in water resources planning and use. Again, just this is a graphic. Just I don't want you to memorize this graphic, but I think it's valuable in terms of ways of thinking. You know, recharge is, as that hydrologic cycle was talking about, it's the water that essentially falls from the sky as either snow or rain. And in this place, here's one place high in LaSalle's where you can get recharge from precipitation. But as you can see, recharge occurs at another place. And of course, as the rain falls or snow falls down here, it's also recharge to some degree. It's not just high in the mountains. Though there is some differences of opinion about how much falls high in the mountains and how much falls in the lower zones. But the reality is the water that hits even the rocks, some of it slowly sinks in, some of it runs off. It might make its way to a creek bottom. Some of it evaporates back up. It's not really recharging except the system. But the concept of discharge, meaning that how water can come out of the system, is again call them gaining streams, where the groundwater is pushing up and becomes surface water. That's a gaining stream. And a losing stream is where the surface water is, due to the influence of gravity and others, geology, recharge from losing streams, runoff moves down into the groundwater. Wells pulling up water out of the earth, that's a discharge as well. Same way as springs, it's a discharge. And down here, wetland evapotranspiration, and also there are phreatophytes, or growing trees, if you will, and plants growing along Mill Creek and Pack Creek and North Fork, and even out in the valley of crops. So there's evaporation not just in the wetland, but this is one place to show where evapotranspiration does occur. And one of the unique things that came out of the USGS study, we'll talk about that in a moment, is out here at through the release from the wetlands into the Colorado River, there's a brine layer, a very salty layer that's overlain by a thin layer of fresh water. And the discovery of that during the USGS study put a new perspective on how much water was discharged into the Colorado River. In the past, best science had shown that, as an example, just this whole thing was fresh water, this whole square, and I'm not saying that it really exists as a square, but the concept would be all blue, would be all fresh water. Based on their investigation, they discovered this brine layer, which limited the amount of fresh water, which plays into how much water is really getting to the Colorado River as groundwater budget. Now to talk a little bit about the publications. There's the USGS report. I've referenced it. It was we participated as a stakeholder, along with some other agencies, and I'll talk more about each one of these in detail. Then there's the GARDNER report. GARDNER was a member of the USGS team. The KOLM reports, Dr. KOLM, who works for the city, has been under contract to the city. And then the Water Distribution and Storage Master Plan that the city undertook with our other consultants, Hansen, Ellen, and Luz. And we'll talk more about that, why that's even mentioned in here. So that's a fair amount of activity for a sleepy little town known as Moab, in Moab Spanish Valley, because it's an important resource, and that's why they still have this activity. And it's a complex watershed. I wanted to make sure and say that. In my past, I worked at times in the desert down in southern Arizona, where it was just valley fill. It was just it was alluvium, you know, it was pretty much water hits the ground, water sinks into the ground, and how much has been there over time. This is a much more complex system with the rims and the salt dome collapse that, you know, was the genesis of this valley in many ways. So that's why a lot of this science is needed, because it's such a complex system. USGS contributing authors because it was a multidisciplinary study. By that I mean they did geology, geophysics, and geochemistry. They collected samples for the chemistry, so there was field work involved in the USGS report. They modeled subsurface discharge of the wetlands. That graphic I just showed you with the brine layer underneath, that's how they determined that that was what's occurring physically. They used new observation wells in the wetlands, as well as geophysics, surface geophysics, electroresistivity methods. They measured surface base flow. They modeled recharge, and then didn't like the results of it, so kind of set that aside. And they assumed the groundwater available equals groundwater discharge of the Colorado River. And so that's really a key assumption that they made. And the other reports, some of them agree with that. Some take a different approach. But for purposes of a comparison of the numbers, which I'll show here in a few moments, we tried to use all the reports based around this assumption and figure out how each report took groundwater available at the Colorado River so that we could be looking at similar numbers. Okay, it's at that point of concentration. Then there's the Gardner report. Published in 2020, 5 authors from the USGS study that I just talked about published this report. So it's, in my mind, it's a follow-up to the science that was done in the USGS report, and they're focusing on the geochemical element of it, whereas the USGS report included the geophysics, included the geology, included the geochemistry, and this is more of a, in my opinion, a more of a detailed, published in the Journal of Hydrology. They're trying to get it in, or it is in, they have a draft report, focusing on the geochemical approach. Data and the methods are the same, except the addition of the lump parameter model in Gardner, and Mike, I know, is going to talk more about that. Basically, the lump parameter model is a way to measure how much water is recharged or flows through the system. It's a computer model method. The estimated discharge is essentially equal to the USGS report, though they're presented slightly differently because they focused on this lump parameter model as well as the geochemical analysis. And one of the things that's different from the KOLM report, at least, and the USGS study doesn't come out and say that, but the key assumption of the Gardner report is that the culinary water is sourced from deep old aquifer and driven by infiltration from high and low souths, saying that that's where our groundwater comes from. It's a deep but an old aquifer, and the geochemistry essentially measures, and to use a layman's term, but old water and new water, and it's, you know, relative to the age of the water. Then there's the KOLM reports. The KOLM reports are done in 5 phases, where he's modeled the Pack Creek system, the Mill Creek subsystem, overall Spanish Valley system. We've developed a monitoring plan and safe yield recommendation. And you'll notice this published 2018, 2021. The safe yield work isn't done yet. We thought about trying to push this work session off until after the first year, but we were able to work with Ken. He and his wife had some health issues, but to come up with some numbers that we think are comparable to the other reports, but the safe yield recommendation is not done yet. So there's 5 phases. There will be 5 reports. We're in possession of 4 of the reports, but the 5th one's still a work in progress. That's what I mean by that. Dr. KOLM used a classic hydrogeologic methodology, meaning the interaction between water, surface water, groundwater, and geology were important, to him more so. He didn't generate any new geochemistry or any new geophysics, though he did consider available data both from hydrologists, and that he referenced the USGS report a couple of times in his study too. But it's a little different approach, and that's kind of what I'm trying to point out in these different reports. Took different approaches. I don't think any of them are necessarily wrong, but scientists can sit around and talk about why one is better, why one is worse, and there ultimately decisions can be made regarding that. But at this point in time, I say they're all good studies. He just took a little different approach, and looking at them cumulatively, I think benefits us as a city because there's a wealth of information available to help guide policy. Conclusion, groundwater use is close to being maximized. In other words, the subsurface, what we're using is just about what's being recharged right now. One of the differences between Dr. KOLM and Dr. Gardner's work is that culinary water is sourced from relatively young, shallow aquifer in a complex network of fractured sandstones. And part of the question there too is, you see I put in relatively shallow. The definition of what's shallow and what's deep is something that has to be further refined between these reports. Mill Creek surface water is connected to groundwater, and water readily exchanges between the two. Back to the losing streams and the gaining streams, those are an important concept, that the amount of water is moving down through that system. And unlike the USGS and Gardner, KOLM estimates detailed evaporation, which is a discharge, recall, from plants due to pheratophytes. USGS and Gardner use a computer model to come up with a number for evaporation losses or discharges from pheratophytes. My staff worked, and we worked with Dr. KOLM to do detailed mapping of the vegetation within our watershed, and he used numbers that have been published for how much water is consumed from pheratophytes or vegetation. And so, as opposed to just looking at what's exiting at the Colorado River, he in more detail considers evapotranspiration losses from plant growth, which is significant. The Water Distribution and Storage Master Plan, this was done in compliance, finished in 2019. It estimates the peak and yearly average demand for year 2060, which is requirements in Utah State Code. They didn't, and this report utilized Utah State methods, which doesn't go into how much water is there subsurface or how much water is generated on an annual basis like these other reports. We're trying to come up with those numbers. This is a process which they use based on connections, based on equivalent residential units, based on projected growth over the next 40 years. And it takes into account indoor and outdoor use, which for us is important because in the city, I know there are exceptions with Moab irrigation, but short of those, residents in the city use culinary water for landscape. So, and that's a question I know Carly's and I are going to, we've had long discussions about, and I think we're going to talk about some of that today, hopefully. And then there's the Department of Water Resources. The Department of Water Resources, they did a summary of findings, and essentially they took the USGS report as its base study, and then they modified it internally. And I don't have a report that they did per se, you know, which is, you know, 40 pages long showing their calculations, but they have published their end results in a PowerPoint slide. And I've spoken with Mr. Stilson, Mark Stilson, who's the deputy chief engineer, about what process they used. And so that's the number that they've come up with, a number that they like. And I'm about to show you. These numbers are just, and they estimated groundwater available for future use. So that's what I'm going to show you on the next table. Is we were trying to get to the number, which is how much water do we have? We know how much water we use. We know how much water the state 40-year plan says we should be using within the city in 40 years. And then the question of how much we have is what the other studies have been trying to really evaluate. Both how much is generated, how much is consumed, and how much may be available subsurface in an aquifer. So this is the report results comparison for a groundwater budget in acre feet per year. So discharge is in acre feet per year, and available is what the projection is at the outflow to the Colorado River. Back to my earlier comment. And so the USGS, they produced a range and said, well, it could be as little as 300 acre feet per year, could be as much as 1,000 acre feet per year is available in excess to what we're using at essentially this snapshot in time, we're currently using. Department of Water Resources came up with because theirs was based quite a bit, they didn't utilize some of the surface water inputs that USGS used. They took out some of the surface water inputs. So this discharge is lower than this number, but their available came up to be between 1,300 acre feet per year and 3,500 acre feet per year. Not exclusively for the city, but for the watershed. And that's at the outflow to the Colorado River. Gardner report essentially says lump parameter model measures what's going into the system, and what's going into the system is what's going out of the system. And he says there's zero available because we're using the 13,600, which is close to the USGS. And then the KOLM reports, assuming that there's not these detailed evapotranspiration, which the other reports assume. That's why it took us a while to try and make all these as close to apples, though some of them may be crab apples and some of them might be red apples and some might be golden delicious, but we're trying to get them closer, and not make them apples and oranges, right? He says 2,400 is available, 2,400 acre feet. The water master plan, we currently use based on the state's projections of their methodology, call it 2,400 acre feet. And our numbers at the beginning, remember I showed that we use between 1,800 and 2,400 acre feet per year. It varies, you know, on a given year. On a really wet, rainy year, I think we use less in landscape, as an example. And then in 2060, the city would use 3,801. So between 2020, then over the next 40 years, we're projected to have a need of an additional 1,400 acre feet for the city, if we don't change the way we do business now. As one way to look at it. And you can see in KOLM's numbers, you know, that's close. That's close. That max 3,500. The zero is not close. But somewhere in there, there's a range. And the question is, do we have enough water? I know it's the question everyone wants an answer to. And I think we can come up with that answer. And we're well on our way to that. Right now, I'm reporting to you that the estimated physical water availability, based on what I just showed you, was between 0 and 3,500 acre feet, based on those reports and the assumptions I outlined. The available city water rights is we have 9,633 acre feet of water rights, which means if we had 9,633 acre feet of water available to us, we could use it because we have those water rights. We have more water rights than we have physical water, it appears, short of doing things like importing water from the Colorado River or finding another aquifer. So right now, water rights are not the issue for us. And that's a good position for the city to be in. The people before us, both councils and staff, because 2 years ago, we sat for days going through every water right, bringing them up to, maybe weeks through the water rights. They did a tremendous job on protecting the city's interests by gathering the water rights. Tremendous job. That's not the issue now. And other cities, that is an issue. More scientific work is needed to reach consensus as to the amount of undeveloped water available. I showed you that range, but we kind of did a little manipulation to try and get them close to being the same discharge point at the Colorado, though there's an argument to be made that there's other places to look at that as well. And in the meantime, water conservation measures should be enhanced to make the most of the water we have. There are things we can do, and I'm going to turn this over to Carly right now, unless there's questions, but I did want to show you that she's going to talk, I think, about water conservation measures, policies, and such. But one of the things on this third bullet, more scientific work is needed. A good thing is that the city maintains, I believe, good relationships with other agencies, the state, the feds, whether it's USGS, whether it's Utah Geological Society, or whether it's water resources. And we've had conversations that have been follow-ups to these reports, because I'm not the only one who's saying that there's differences. The water board has looked at some of these reports and have opinions, obviously. And Mike's going to talk about some of that, I think, in a bit. But one of the things we've tried to do, and DWR is really leading the charge to give credit where credit's due, they're really pushing to try and collect more data, more information. And I believe, and my recommendation to council is that it's in the city's interest to participate in doing monitoring and data collection as much as we can afford, not to make it in. And so one of the things that I was going to show you that we're doing this in real time is that today, this is our abandoned well number 4, which is the well we're going to replace. It's a well that's with our new well number 12 that we've been talking about. This is the old well casing out at the golf course. This is Mark Stilson from DWR and his colleague. And this was happening at about 11 o'clock this morning. And what they're doing is they're doing downhole camera evaluation of the well to better understand the aquifer, where there are sandy zones, where there are fractured zones, where there are different types of geology. And of course, there's our crews, Levi, it looks like Conrad, but I could be wrong, or Ryan, working cooperatively to get them access to there. And this is the gentleman from the US Geological Survey. So we had city, state, and federal people working to collect information that'll help us understand our system better. And this particular activity cost us staff time, but it didn't cost us any money. The state put in there. Maybe some other things where we need to do some cost sharing, and I'm hoping that we can do that. But with that, I'd like to say, are there any questions, or should I turn the time to Carly to keep things moving? Mary?
Chuck, let's go ahead and unshare your screen. So that if we do have questions or comments at this time, we can see hands. I just want to make a comment that Levi, that was an outstanding selfie in the conclusion of that presentation. I appreciate the outstanding selfie. And I'm sure, Mike, you're going to be commenting later, and we might have some questions for you and as well, Carly. So we'll just move right along. So Carly, I don't see any hands, so moving right along.
Thank you, Mayor. So I have been looking forward to this special meeting to discuss water resources because, as you know, in my former life up in Salt Lake City, water policy was my bread and butter. So I'm happy to be able to talk about this topic, and forgive me if I wonk out too much as I get going, but and I want to thank Chuck for providing that summary of all the work done regarding our current understanding of the water budget. And I know this council is very interested in ensuring that our water supply is safe and secure. And I've had several of you mention that it's going to be a priority in the coming year. So I guess I wanted to just take a couple of minutes to sort of take a step back and explain a bit how someone like me or Chuck thinks about water resource planning and management. Because I think if I provide some context, it'll make sense why some of the recommended next steps are what they are. And so just if you don't mind me, I'm also going to share a slide presentation. Let me share my screen. Okay, let's get this baby started. Okay. So I was trained, or like my background is in a discipline referred to as integrated water resource management or integrated water resource planning. This is an industry, a water industry term that refers to a process that promotes coordinated development and management of like water, land, and other resources. The coordinated management is meant to maximize economic and environmental and social considerations. So the APA uses a similar term to describe a process that looks like holistically at planning and management of water supply and sees the water system as one continuous system, right from like a water cycle system. So it focuses on wastewater, water, and stormwater systems. And those actually can overlap with what I'm talking about with water industry standard as well. Just looking at basically all components on a really dynamic system that influences many different interests and competing users. So for this next slide, I wanted to introduce you to some general principles that guide the management of an integrated framework like this. The first is that water planning should engage all levels of government as well as private entities to ensure that development and future water needs are consistent with availability and supply. And you might be asking how you do something like this. How do we ensure that our future water needs are met? So you go and you establish a reliable water supply and availability, which we've done. We have many water rights in a water system. We determine and quantify water needs for future growth. Chuck talked about that earlier with the water distribution plan. And we establish and incentivize water conservation and water quality protection measures. So making sure that we're using the water prudently and making sure that we're protecting the source. Second, another principle is that land development plans should achieve development that results in sustainable land use patterns and also efficiently uses the scarce water resource. So you do this by protecting surface and groundwater supplies, promoting efficient water conveyance and use, protecting water quality, and facilitating water conservation, storage, and reuse. And finally, a third principle is ensuring that funding for construction and maintenance of our water infrastructure is fully allocated. So it must be designed and built and maintained to protect and conserve our very precious water resources. And let me know if you have questions on anything. I'm looking for hands. I only see a couple of you though. So keeping these principles in mind, I want to let you know what I think of when I look at our water system and what are our biggest vulnerabilities and what should be our biggest priorities. So we have a really undeveloped water conservation program, basically no conservation policies in code or in practice. We do have a water conservation board, but they have not yet developed any meaningful policies or programs. So this is a really great opportunity to more fully develop that kind of programming and that policy making. We have an aging water system, which we all know about. Our water system has no right to be running as well as it does. And it's a testament to Levi and our public works crew that it is doing so well. It's just their fastidious maintenance of it. But we all know it's, we have to get real about investing in our water system. We also have little control over aquifer management. You know, we're not the only user of this aquifer. You know, we have GWISA and Moab Irrigation Company, San Juan County. So we can do everything right on our end, but if other users aren't prudently managing their water drawing, we may suffer. We also have few regulations or policies or practices in place to protect our source water. So this is mostly logistical and jurisdictional. We get water from Manti La Sal National Forest. We have no jurisdiction over them. Or our water is being sourced from other places outside our jurisdiction. So those are four vulnerabilities that I've identified. And the recommendations that Chuck and I are coming up with sort of target these vulnerabilities, if that makes sense. Chuck and I have come up with a list of general priorities that we're eager to discuss with you more about in the upcoming year and of course during this meeting. And they are relatively self-explanatory. I can review them quickly. Basically, first, to continue understanding the hydrological conditions, engaging in the KOLM report and the other reporting that is going on, prioritizing and implementing new water conservation policies. I'll talk about those in another slide. Investing in our infrastructure, which I just discussed, as our existing infrastructure and potentially future water infrastructure. Continuing our monitoring and data collection. We can't do anything unless we know what's actually being happened and without measuring it. So that's important. Pursue some options that protect our aquifer from harmful development impacts, whether that's at the national forest level with Manti La Sal, whether that's development like in places like Johnson's up on top, if it's other sort of development that may impact our aquifer health. And engage more robustly with other water users to protect these water resources. Any questions on those? So I've got all the answers. All right. So I mentioned water conservation and I wanted to talk a little bit more about that. It's because it's just so foundational to prudent water management is conservation. It's also mandated by the state. As you can see, and I know that Kaylin sent out an email that detailed this really well, but we have a water conservation plan due in 2022. It's required to be updated. And we also have some regional M&I goals or municipal and industrial goals mandated by the state. We have to achieve 20% reduction by 2030 from our 2015 water use levels. So those have to happen regardless of what the water budget says. We have to achieve this type of conservation. Some of these practices are really straightforward. I'm surprised we don't have them because many communities around Utah do, especially some of the ordinances like a time of day watering ordinance, landscape ordinance, green infrastructure, and a water shortage contingency ordinance. All of these water conservation practices that I've listed are low-hanging fruit that any community should have in place before considering anything more drastic. This is for several reasons. So these water conservation programs are well studied and they're well understood. So we won't be reinventing the wheel. They are inexpensive. And very importantly, they're politically and legally defensible. I do want to underscore the importance of having any water regulatory regime being legally and politically tested and defensible, sorry. Because I can personally attest to that famous Mark Twain quote that's water is, or in the West, whiskey is for drinking, water is for fighting over. And I learned that lesson working for Salt Lake City. You may know that back in the early 90s, Salt Lake City enacted strict limitations on their surplus water contract sales in the central Wasatch Mountains. And their regime for that is really simple and it's very elegant and it's highly effective, but it's also very controversial. And Salt Lake City has spent 30 years and substantial resources defending that ordinance in court and up at the legislature. So, Salt Lake City Public Utilities has 400 employees and a $270 million operating budget. So they can withstand that onslaught. But for a smaller community like Moab, that's why I favor like tried and tested water conservation programs. So with that, and then Chuck is going to be speaking on these next slides about some infrastructure investments.
Yeah, we just wanted to let you know that we're talking about things we can improve upon in the future, but we're working on that now as well. I want to make sure that and give you an update on where we're at. Replacement well 12 is designed, and we're one step away from having the final permit expected any time now. Construction will occur in spring of 2021 if the bond is completed. And that's just a reminder that when the council adopted the rates, that there was a bond in year 2020, fiscal year 2021, that will allow us to go out and do some of these key projects. And that was in the economic pro forma. And Clint and Joel and I are working on that currently. So I don't mean to imply that the bond's not going to happen. It's just that that's a first step in order for us to afford that well. We're going to participate with the Interagency Coalition to monitor the aquifer. This will have a dollar cost. It'll be a relatively small dollar cost, but I'm hoping, is that one of those things, Mayor, that we're going to have to move on pretty quick, that we could get a thumbs up or thumbs down from the council members if they support that are participating with these interagency monitoring programs? Is that something that's okay?
Yeah, and do you want to do that right now?
Whatever you think's appropriate time. I just
well, I think it would be helpful to get through the rest of today's meeting. I think also we're missing 2 council members here at this meeting. But in lieu of a thumbs up during this meeting, what might be better is for you to just reach out to council. Maybe by email and just solicit any concerns about moving forward.
Okay, we'll do.
I think that's probably the best.
Yeah, Chuck, if you have any information on, a little more details about what would come out of the study, that would be useful information, that would be great.
Okay, I'll do that. I'll put together a description of that and some level of costs and things like that. Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
System security and optimization, evaluation and upgrades, including our wells, our springs, our chlorination facilities, and our water tanks. That was part of the economic pro forma too. We have money in there. We need to, again, the Public Works Group and the Water Department have done a yeoman's job working with what they've had over the years, but they haven't been able to keep up with maintenance of some of our facilities because they've been they only had money to fix the breaks. So now we've got some money in this bond program that'll help address some of those issues. And we'll design them in 2021. Construction will begin in 2021, but it's going to have to continue for the next 5 years as funds are available. So we have a chunk of money in that bond program, and we'll spend that pretty quick. But as each budget comes up in a year, we'll, as part of the budget process, we'll make, Levi will make, I'll work with Levi and he'll make recommendations for what we can afford and what would be a priority that year. Next slide, Carly. Is there another one? Yeah. Thank you. So those projects then that'll happen in the near future besides the well also is the Mill Creek Drive water line improvements. The design is complete and has been approved by drinking water. Construction in spring of 2021 if the bond is completed. That'll replace a major piece of our distribution system down Mill Creek Drive, essentially from 400 East out to Murphy Lane, essentially. We now can pursue the Spanish Valley water tank now that we've got the rates in place. I've been in contact with the Drinking Water Board. We'll sometime in 2021 we'll go and apply for the other half of the money to do that Spanish Valley water tank, because that tank will improve our fire flows as well as give us resiliency throughout the system. And then we've also got some money in there for some distribution system upgrades as funds are available, meaning as we get actual costs from these other projects, we'll use what we can because we have that priority project list. So just thought it's a good time to say that what's coming up, and council will be, approving those things. Hopefully, as you move forward, you'll see them and have the opportunity to approve them or comment on them too. I think that's it, Carly, right? Yeah.
Well, thanks, Chuck, and thanks, Carly, for those presentations. I definitely think that I can say confidently that this council is very much in favor of a focus on water going into 2021. In many meetings and every time we talk about development, water is the most important, always rises to the top as most important question that still needs to be answered. So I really appreciate, I think for many of us, a lot of that was review, but also at the same time, it was putting it all together. So Chuck, thank you for going, through the details of the who and the what and where we are today with the reports that we're talking about. Even the graphic of 1 acre feet is really helpful. And Carly, thanks for that history too, as well, of, when we start thinking about like how we move forward and why we move forward in those certain ways. And it's really good for us to know what our budget is, what our size is, and what our intentions are when moving forward with policy. So you did a great job there. So thank you both very much for going through those presentations. Very helpful. I'm just, I realized that I should not have closed my agenda because I do believe we are moving on to either Q&A with you or our next agenda item and then general Q&A. So let's see. Without me having to pull up the agenda, because I definitely closed it. Council members, let me ask you this. Are you comfortable with moving on to Mike's presentation and then having a discussion around all things water in conclusion of that? Or would you like to have a discussion now?
I'm okay with the former. I do need to end at 2. So I'd just like to have a reasonable amount of time at the end for that discussion.
Okay, thank you. Mike, what is the length do you think of your presentation?
How about I make it no more than about 20, 25 minutes. That'll give us 20 minutes after I'm done for 4 o'clock. Would that work?
That should be okay. Ronnie, does that sound good to you? Okay, Mike, take it away.
Okay, let me share my screen. Okay, so I have 2 objectives. Can you guys hear me and see okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay. All right. So I have two objectives in this particular presentation. And both of them are politically motivated. I'm interested in the technical aspects of water and so forth. But I'm trying to, push council, as you'll see just shortly, into trying to, during the next calendar year, to try to get some ordinances on the books to get a better handle on how much water we're about to commit to new commercial and residential uses to, and much better bookkeeping, and establishing what I could call a metering or a quota system, if you will. In other words, we can set those limits and quotas to big numbers if we like in the beginning, but I want to, it's kind of like having a zeroed out municipal property tax on the books. We don't really have to use it right now, but I want all the infrastructure in place so that when we do need to use it, we'll already have the tools that we need in place on the books ready to go, rather than try to negotiate all that in years down the road. And B, the other thing I'm trying to do is put political pressure, frankly, on DWR. Mr. Stilson has been great. Mark is coming around, okay, to realizing that we're much closer to a water limited future, which is great. I would love, Mark, I'll preface this by saying Mark is, would ideally like to finish the adjudication and then have a formal groundwater management plan process. And maybe 2 years down the road, we might finally get around to talking about safe yield. I would like to bump the safe yield discussion up, put it up front, because everything hinges on what that safe yield number is. You saw what big variances we have on it. And at least two people think that we're basically down close to using it now. I would love to get Mark and Ken KOLM and Phil Gardner and all the pros, Chuck, of course, and water department, all in the same room and thrash this out right now. I'm talking about the Glen Canyon aquifer now, where both the city and the county and San Juan County draw their water from. Because there are other sources of water, as Mark Stilson pointed out, but they involve the valley fill, which is a whole host of problems. Not that you can't do it, you can, but it's more expensive, as we'll see here in just a moment. So any other questions? This title slide just shows you, you guys have noticed, I think, that we're growing kids, but we can't wait too long. There's a lot of people moving in. Meanwhile, the water resources are declining, basically. You notice not much snow on the mountains this year, summer drought. La Nina cycle that we're in right now, and climate change is rearing its ugly head as well. So there's a reason to be concerned. Chuck has showed you the slide. That came from Mark's presentation. Thank you very much, Mark. He's seen you this slide of what the watershed area looks like as well. The only other thing I have to say about this is you guys may have noticed these funny looking little yellow lines out here. That's Moab Irrigation Company's pipelines. I'm on the board of the irrigation company. These two way up high are basically go to what's the first North? Can't remember the name of the North Mesa now, but this is South Mesa, Wilson Mesa, I believe it is. There's two big farms out there that have been there forever, and there's a significant amount of water in Mill Creek that's picked off right there. And then down in town, there are 3 ditches altogether, one at the far east end, and then 2 more that run across town. And Moab Irrigation Company owns something like 6,000 acre feet of water, surface water in Mill Creek. And that's an obvious place to use for culinary water with some trouble. That's typically what happens, except that Moab Irrigation Company has a whole host of users and they may not want to give it up. So that's an interesting trade-off there. Chuck's already showed you this graphic of where the water comes from. Basically, there's a valley fill aquifer, relatively salty water, the collapsed salt dome with one chemical signature. This is the big thing that Phil Gardner pointed out. He's and a different chemical signature from the water that comes out of the high La Salle Mountains out here and comes down Sand Flats. Phil has disagreed with Dr. KOLM about where the water comes from in the golf course area, because he sees the chemical signature of this as opposed to Mill Creek, which looks more like the valley fill aquifer out there. So as I say, I'd love to get all the pros together and thrash all this out sooner rather than better. As soon as we have a safe yield number, then we can decide what rationally to do after that. Let's see, let me get rid of this. The Department of Water Rights has a very nice website page now showing a number of wells in the valley and what they've been doing since 1970. We had a relatively dry period out here in the 1970s and the 80s. It started raining about the same time Kens Lake went in. All the well levels went up, and basically they've been declining ever since. You can see that they seem to be declining a little more as you get down to the south end of the valley. But both Mark and I have done our own research projects as well as these plots, and they all say the same thing, that the well levels are slowly declining, and that's an ominous sign. Now, right now, the city presently assumes it can serve water. We don't even bother to put in will serve commitments that I know of, considered by the planning department. I know when I was sitting on the county watering board years ago, every app had to have a will serve letter from GWSSA. We may have thought we got away with it because we had lots of paper water rights, but doesn't really mean much if the water isn't really there. And I'm going to quote John Wesley Powell again. He was the first one to, I love this saying, years of drought and famine come, and years of flood and famine come. And the climate is not changed with dance, libation, or prayer. And once we start talking about quotas and so forth, you're going to hear a lot of people saying we're going to try to change it with dance, libation, or prayer. You watch. So the end game for this discussion is, besides trying to get an early conference on the safe yield question, is I would like city policy changes to come out next year. As I've already said, metering. The metering will be in units of equivalent residential connections, about 400 gallons a day or half an acre foot per year. And obviously we're going to participate in the groundwater management plan. And these policy changes need not and should not wait for the groundwater management plan process to complete. It's likely a few years away. Development continues on. Wise water policy means not making commitments we can't fulfill. And the city can adopt, Lori can correct me if I'm wrong, but the city can adopt any water policy we want as long as we don't violate state law. And finally, here's some ideas to throw out about what we might mean by metering. This is something we're all going to be debating, but it starts off with better for explicitly accepting or denying requests for new water and planning applications, keeping better records, a new annual ERC quota, perhaps a maximum ERC limit for any single application. And then there's some good news in here as well. There's offering ERC bonuses for conservation or use of secondary water use. Secondary water use, by the way, is a term for surface water, like the Moab Irrigation Company, for example. Things can change from time to time, and the metering rules should be amended periodically. It might be more optimistic, we find out, it might not. And finally, applicants who contribute their own Glen Canyon group withdrawals obviously aren't subject to these kinds of limits. And anybody who can contribute their own water that doesn't come out of the Glen Canyon aquifer would not be subject to this either. So the problem is safe yield in the Glen Canyon aquifer. Chuck tucked on this, but here's the basic water budget issue. We're talking culinary water here, not irrigation water. We're talking groundwater, not surface water. Water rights aren't the issue. Aquifer capacity is the issue. Chuck's touched on these numbers as well, so I'll say it again. 2,300 acre feet for the city, more or less, in 2019. 1,100 acre feet in Grand County and San Juan Spanish Valley Special Service District. Right now has one well in that's been up and running, 500 acre feet, but they've got another 4,500 acre feet of tentatively, I'll put it, approved applications that were granted back in 2011. If they have to, they can go to the Colorado River to get it, but they would much rather get it out of the Glen Canyon aquifer. I'm very dubious about the other 4,500 feet being available. So how much water do we have to use? That, of course, is the great bulk of Chuck's discussion. Here's another take on it. In a little more detail, here's what the city uses. We're running out of time, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but basically, as Chuck said, the 4 springs and 2 wells, and well number 7 could be put to use for culinary rather than just feeding the golf course. Here's kind of a contribution from the various sources from the city. The county also taps the Glen Canyon Aquifer. Okay, those wells are farther south. Chapman is the big heavy hitter out there. This is the one that the pump went south on them earlier this summer, and they were in a world of hurt, much like we were for a while when one of our wells went down. They've also got George White wells number 4 and 5 that are right on the east edge of the aquifer. Anyway, their reports to DWRI in 2019 were about a little over 1,000 acre feet. Here's San Juan counties. Well, these are these little maps. This comes out of the DWRI website. This is not all of them. There's more of them, but these are the ones that are near Kins Lake. As I said, 500 acre feet from this well right here is already in service. That is Special Service District well number 1. Some people call all this development out there what San Juan County would like to do on Sitla land, a South Moab development. Talked about a lot of people. We shall see. It's junior water rights. And I've already talked about where else they might get the water from if this doesn't play out. So this is still another reason to establish safe yield, because we just can't wait for DWR to approve a bunch more wells out here only to find out the water isn't really there. Okay, so that looks like a little bit of a duplication there. So the total Glen Canyon aquifers are about 3,800 acre feet. And as Chuck pointed out, with new developments in the pipeline, that will grow. It varies from year to year, as Chuck pointed out. In wet years, we actually use a little bit less. That 3,800 acre feet number does not count lower Spanish Valley Springs. Doesn't count private wells. Like I've got friends that live up in the not Navajo Ridge, but Cayena Heights development up there. All those folks have private wells. So there's quite a few of them. They're not part of this picture. And they are, for the most part, in the Glen Canyon Aquifer. They have to go pretty deep, several hundred acre feet, but that's what they're doing. So there's perhaps a non-significant amount of water in private wells that is not part of this detail. So just to refresh it, how do people try to estimate how much water do we have to use? There's 3 techniques, okay? One is by trying to measure, by modeling groundwater recharge mathematically, by precipitation forecast, and then trying to estimate how much of it actually sinks into the ground and gets into the water table rather than running off. So it's a tricky business. It's difficult to do accurately. The second method is by observing discharge in surface streams and springs. And that's what the USGS did 2-3 years ago. It makes the assumption, though, that recharge equals discharge. And that is an assumption that I love to point out is not easily verifiable, and it's not obvious to me at all, since Moab has been growing in recent decades, that it's in a state of equilibrium. Okay, we could be sucking it dry right now, and we really don't even know. The declining springs levels is a contraindication to that. As Chuck pointed out, 3 contemporary studies. To summarize them again, well, the USGS had 10 to 30,000 acre feet with the recharge method, 13 to 15. And I want to point out of that what looks like a big number, the biggest discharge is Mill Creek surface water. It's also called base flow. That you guys should look out the door right now at Mill Creek running through town, and you'll see there's quite a bit of water flowing in there right this moment as I speak. It's obviously hasn't rained and snow hasn't melted much yet. And so where's the water coming from? And the answer is it's coming out of groundwater in the mountains. And it will continue to flow for years. And that's so-called base flow, but it's both surface water and at one point it was groundwater. And anyway, so that discharge is part of this number, and it looks like there's a lot of water there, but it's really not available to us in the sense that surface water whose rights are owned by somebody else. These numbers count groundwater in the whole watershed. That's both the La Salle's and the lower valley floor. So the good culinary water comes from the Glen Canyon Group aquifer, and the poor, somewhat saltier irrigation water comes out of the valley fill. So Chuck's already talked about Ken KOLM's work. Ken did some good stuff for us. I'll kind of gloss over much of this. He did do a water budget study in phase 2. This little graphic here, which you can see right here, blah, 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 you know, Ken picked a so-called water budget area for convenience with these boundaries in part because he chose it so that the geologically there was what he called a no-flow zone along much of this. There's only a few places here where Mill Creek comes in and here where Mill Creek comes out and a few other streams and so forth where water actually comes in and gets out. So it made it easy to calculate mathematically. But I want to point out that it's a questionable technique in my mind in the sense that there's not really a lot of precip that falls down here. All the water falls over here. Okay, so it's kind of a wild ass guess, and Ken may take exception with me on this. I'll call it a scientific wild ass guess. We used to call it swags in the aerospace business. So anyway, so Ken's water budget amounts to adding up a bunch of numbers, all of which have some uncertainties to them for water coming in, another group of numbers for water coming out. And ideally, they ought to balance if the aquifer is stable. And anyway, so Ken, as Chuck said, is a classical geohydrologist, I guess you'd call him. So both myself and other members of the water board had some questions, we think, that reduced our confidence in the water budget that Ken put out. The groundwater in and out estimates are not sure about. Vegetation losses, Cara Darwin was our big phreatophyte expert. She was nervous about it, pointing out that the phreatophytes have changed with different kinds of vegetation. Ken didn't use geochemical tracers. He didn't, while he did address infiltration in the high-low solves, he really didn't integrate it into his model. And you could separate out in his model what's surface water and what's groundwater. And while he did make an attempt here and there to measure the transfers between the two in the area, he really didn't look to see if in this, what he called the pre-development days, if if surface water in matched surface water going out. You can see that, in my opinion anyway, that it has to match in the long run, or otherwise all the water would dry up inside that big area I just pointed up to, or the whole thing would be drowned in a lake, and obviously that's not happening. So Ken's model doesn't balance the surface water. So then we come to Phil Gardner's article, the Journal of Hydrology. I got 10 more minutes, okay. Journal of Hydrology. This is the very nifty graphic that Phil went to. He starts over here in the high mountains. The Glen Canyon Group aquifer, by the way, is 3 layers. It's the Navajo on top, a somewhat less permeable layer of Cayenta in the middle, and then the Wingate sandstone in the bottom, which is permeable. So the USGS study assumed that all the water moved freely among those 3 layers. Phil now thinks that that's not always the case, and in some places, the middle layer acts like a confining layer. So he subdivided it into the shallow Glen Canyon group, where presumably surface waters like Mill Creek would be sourced from or drained to. And then the so-called deep layer, which takes much longer, 2,700 years, he found out from radiocarbon 14 dating, to reach from the high mountains down to our edge of the valley floor. 2,700 years is an independent measurement, as I said, he did with radiocarbon dating, and that's a great number that we're going to get to later on. So again, here's my take on the question we all want to know: how much water do we have to grow on? And I think less than you think. All right, here's the new hooker. That's the Journal of Hydrology study, and Phil Gardner thinks that there were at safe yield value now. If and when the division, it doesn't matter what Phil thinks it is. It doesn't matter what I think it is. It's what the Division of Water Rights thinks it is that matters. Okay, and that'll be a subject of the groundwater management plan process. And as I say, something I'd rather address sooner rather than later. But whenever a number is assigned to it, it will mean there will be no new net withdrawal from that aquifer. Don't care how many paper water rights you get. totally, you just can't suck more water out of it. That's a big paradigm shift, kids, because ever since the white man moved into the area, there's always been water to grow on. And not anymore, if this comes to pass. Chuck's already talked about legal definitions of safe yield, so I won't go through that again. And if the Glen Canyon Group were closed to new withdrawals, what other sources could be tapped for culinary city use? The short answer is nothing's easy. It's got legal, water right, quality, cost, infrastructure, and environmental consequences. The biggest discharge, as USGS found out, is Mill Creek itself, since they didn't distinguish at that time between surface and deep water or deep aquifer. So its water rights are owned by the irrigation company, which is a nonprofit, by the way, but their water rights go all the way back to 1890. But if they were amenable, and they might be, you could trade agricultural uses for municipal uses. That's oftentimes what municipalities do. The only other aquifer around is a valley fill aquifer. A lot of people plunk down wells, and there's hundreds and hundreds and maybe thousands of wells in the valley. So it's poor, salty water, but you could treat it. So it's an option. One of Mark Stilson's sources of new water that was part of the budget that Chuck presented to us a moment ago was included groundwater underflow, so-called underflow to the Colorado River. And yeah, you could tap it, but I suspect that it would result in environmental consequences to the wetlands. So we'd have to think hard about if we wanted to do that or not. And finally, the county owns, I believe it's 3 cubic feet per second, if I got that right, water rights to the Colorado River. It's always been there. They haven't employed it because it's way easier to use the wells up high. But if they did so, it would be expensive to pump and store. And right now, the state thinks that Utah's got something on the order of 200,000 acre feet a year of excess Colorado River water that they could use. Then other people tell me, Mr. Weisheit tells me that that's could be revised downwards. And with climate change staring at us, I would like to rather err on the safe side. But anyway, that 3 CFS could be subject to Colorado River Compact restrictions. I agree perfectly. I think we're all agree that more study is needed. So I won't talk about that further. And finally, to kind of conclude this part of the presentation, we have a painful but manageable paradigm shift in front of us. But you can count on water is going to get more expensive. We'll have to conserve or buy, trade, share, or bank for new water. And this could be choke off somewhat residential and commercial growth, which is not, depending on your point of view, you know, if you're a developer, that's bad news. If you're like many residents, whatever side of your political spectrum is, who aren't comfortable with continued and rapid growth in town, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. But it is a different way of looking at it. You guys have all seen pictures of Lake Powell. I think that's Lake Powell. I picked that one off the web. It's a little scary. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, let me ask you guys, it's about 20 minutes. I probably should stop right here. The remaining slides, you guys can look at it at your leisure. It gets into the weeds. Talks about how an aquifer, you can think of it as a bucket of wet sand. That goes on what you mean, fancy graphs and stuff. Talks about Mr. Gardner's report, what it says, why it matters, why I have some confidence in it, because he used chemistry. Again, he doesn't agree with some of the ways that Ken looked at it. So I'd love to get him to sit down together and thrash this out. But basically, Gardner thinks the water comes out of the high La Salle Mountains here. It goes 25 kilometers, it looks like, and arrives down there and takes 2,700 years to get there. There's the same picture again. This is a lump parameter model. It's pretty simple. It just basically says if you have a box, if you will, of known size, and you can measure the time at which water goes in and the time at which it comes out, then you can calculate how fast the water has to be going through there. And that's what Mr. Gardner did, with a complication that only part of it, precipitation only falls in part of it, the rest of it just moves down the hill, so to speak. He's got a bunch of parameters that go into this formula. It's got a nifty formula. I wasn't a systems engineer for nothing. But all these things have uncertainties with them. So Phil can't be sure about exactly whether his model is right, but using his error bands in there, the tool was one. You guys have studied enough probability. One sigma is one standard deviation off, kind of a reasonable way. But we could have as much as 50% of water to go on according to Phil's analysis. Or we could be that we're overdrawing it right now. We just don't know. So that's what we want to thrash out. So that's about it. So let me unshare my screen unless you guys have any quick questions.
Well, go ahead and unshare because we'll do questions and comments.
Okay, there you go.
Yeah, so thorough. Okay. I feel like I've had a full meal of water, of water information today. And I just want to thank each one of you for putting together those presentations. And also to having Public Works here and engineering here with us as we go through this conversation. So I want to turn the time over, well, maybe first to Kaylin and then to Ronnie to just, you know, share any comments or questions or concerns that you'd like to bring out in light of all of this information and in recognition that, you know, what's being presented to us also is being presented as like what, you know, to be continued in 2021. So Kaylin, why don't you go first?
Sure, thanks. And thanks to all the staff and Mike and the Water Conservation Board and our consultants for their work. It's been a while since we've heard about this, but I can tell that a ton of time and effort and thought has gone into all of this. As we can see from the studies, there is a lot of uncertainty, and I generally favor a precautionary approach because the amount, we could be at safe yield. And in the short term, I think the response to that is accelerated interagency planning, water conservation, and with the understanding that we continue to repeat that we need to define and stay within safe yield in the next few years. One source of new water that wasn't mentioned is that conservation is the cheapest source of that additional water. It's potentially 20% or more. It's low-hanging fruit, and implementing conservation by many methods can provide the legal cover for future restrictions. So I really appreciate Carly articulating that. I also want to point out that based on my understanding, without watershed-wide coordination, if we don't use our paper rights, regardless of whether they're backed up with wet water, eventually those might be reallocated. So I feel like it's really important that we, as we do these restrictions, that we as the city might lead on, that ultimately there's other users that may not be playing ball. So we still have to bring them along to some extent. And I hope that we can maintain the relationships that will help that happen. I also want to point out that I think the most water consumptive new growth will likely occur on unirrigated lands in the county, as opposed to the redevelopment and infill development that's happening in the city. Because converting formerly irrigated lands to hardscape and buildings can use less water than agriculture. And finally, I'm not just interested in conserving water to support new growth, or not even primarily, but for other valued uses in the valley, including food security and supporting our urban forests, to use some catchphrases. And these aren't the most conservative uses, but they contribute greatly to our identity and quality of life. And I feel like it's easy for them to get lost in quantitative discussions about conservation. And sometimes it can be hard to figure out how to value them in these discussions, but I just want to mention them so that we don't lose sight. Thanks.
Thank you.
Kaylin, you know, one thing I just want to point out, since Chuck, you did ask for council opinion, this is a good time for council to share, you know, thoughts around, because it's not certainly a thumbs up situation, but it sounds like Kaylin is supporting moving forward with the action of or with the direction of intergovernmental collaboration. So Ronnie, why don't you go next, and maybe you can speak to that as well, since that was a question from Chuck.
Can I just clarify?
Yeah. Did I say the wrong words?
No, that's fine. But I also want to emphasize that I think there's a bunch of low-hanging water conservation measures that we can implement unilaterally within the city. And ideally, those would be done in cooperation with the other water providers, but sometimes just need to get going and lead.
Yeah, I definitely understood what you were suggesting as a two-part, as a take care of our house, but then also play well with our neighbors. Okay, Ronnie.
Okay. Totally support collaboration with other folks. I think one of the concerns moving forward over time, which some of you have referenced in different ways, that are doesn't do a lot of good if we do everything we can downstream when we don't have control of what's happening upstream. So I think that's really important to all of us, to work well with other people, but to have really good communication. Let's see, I had a number of questions, because when things like this come up and we want to talk about the water that we're using, it's never been clear to me. So I guess I'm going to put in a request to see if we already have this data, or we can generate information on how much water we're already have committed to putting out there that maybe isn't online yet. So that's for all these new condos in the city, for Lions Back, for a lot of things under development that haven't had people in them yet using water. So it may be a small amount, but I'd like to see that number, because it would help me understand how much we're adding to this number.
Rodney, I don't want to interrupt you, but that is almost a question that I don't know. Is that an answerable question right now, Chuck? Because what I had the same question, and that is, of the data that's been presented, was future or like existing, the only way I think of it is like with overnight accommodations, oh my gosh, they're in the pipeline. So are those numbers used in the calculations? I mean, that's what you're essentially asking, right, Ronnie? We've got big projects in the pipeline. This data was collected a while back. Did that data include current projects?
So the 40-year plan takes into account, and I might get this a little bit mixed up, but something like 1.5% growth per year for like 15 years, and then it assumes 1% growth annually thereafter. So there's a growth component to it. So it's a twofold answer. There's a growth component into those projections that development relates to growth, whether it's commercial or residential, right, to some degree. And then the other is we capture it in terms of recovering money at our impact fee level. Ronnie, that translates back, those impact fees are based on equivalent residential units, which is, a function. So we know what the impacts are of each development when we get final development plans, or when we get close to final development plans. Yes, we can project what numbers are for development based on that. And we do that as a function now at the impact level. That is helpful.
May I address Mayor Ronnie's questions?
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah, 1% is okay, but that's a little scary. I know the county, Dana, I talk to her all the time. I remember her remarking last summer that they were saying 2-3% growth out in the county. I'm not sure if that's true for the city, but 1% may be on the conservative side, depends on how things go. And the other part of the answer to your question, Ronnie, I think, is that, I mean, ideally, we'd all like to say, oh, Hotel Hyatt XYZ is going to come in at a certain time. They got 100 rooms and they expect to use so many gallons a day. And was that folded into the 40-year plan? And I think what Chuck is saying, no, they don't have that kind of detail. All they have is a statistical 1 or 1.5%.
Yeah, that's
Go ahead, Ronnie. Oh,
that's
sorry.
Correct. Yeah, that's correct. There's no way of knowing. When we did the sanitary sewer master plan, They based upon zoning in place at the time. But since zoning has changed since then, and I know we're talking water, not sanitary sewer, but those projection numbers have to be based on something. So that's why they utilize that, the state methodology, because no one knows.
Chuck, can I just ask you one quick question? So that 1.5% growth, that's just projections for the city, correct?
That's correct. We just did it for the city.
Okay. I mean, because even with the county's high density overlay, I mean, there's 500 homes that are in the pipeline. That's, you know, even for the county, that'd be way more than 1 to 1.5%. Correct.
Yeah, by the county, you mean GWISA? They have a water master plan too, where they take into account the future projections. I don't know exactly what those percentages are, but I've seen it. And like, as an example, real quick, when USU came on board, the question was asked, was that accounted for in the water? And they had included the development of USU in their water plan. I know that. So I'm not an expert on their water plan, but they do have future projections in it as well.
I want to say it was 2%, Chuck. I've looked at that report not too long ago. Could be wrong, but I think it was a little bigger than the city's numbers.
Let's get back to Ronnie here. Sorry. I just think that was a very juicy point and question that was worth discussing. But continue, Ronnie. Sorry to interrupt.
Oh, no, it's okay. So in general, I like the priorities Mike has laid out and the points that Carly raised. So I kind of would like to know what comes next. Like, logically, to me, it would make sense that we commit, you know, to regular agenda items. I don't know if it's every meeting, but, you know, every so often, so we're eating off chunks of this, and it would help me to have a calendar to know, you know, what we're trying to take on in terms of, I mean, it seems like this is going to impact everything. So it would help me to have a list moving forward of how this impacts the budget. Like, several things in here are brought up that are going to need to be addressed in our next budget. So it would just help to have a list to remind me that I'm going to have to take all those into account, and then kind of to know which ones, you know, what require meetings or workshops over time, so that we do get a good chunk of work done, and we're not just kicking the can down the road. So I know monitoring often gets brought up in that, and the need to commit to more of that. And there's definitely infrastructure elements in here. And you guys have all read this, so you know the other ones. I guess I just want to make sure that when we talk about conservation and things moving in, that there will be some element or opportunity to discuss where we can move from using culinary water in some instances to be using, say, something like gray water, because it does seem like that would help us over time. And I do like that idea. If I just had someone write me today complaining about a school near them that does a lot of watering during the day, I mean, we just get resonant questions about, you know, can't we at least not water during the hottest part of the day? And then I'm sure there'll be a time, there was some mention of water banks. Will be interesting to come back to that. So, I mean, I think largest for me is that I'm supportive, and I definitely interested in making budgetary commitments, but then also time commitments. But it kind of, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but it almost seems like we as a council should then commit to some kind of regular discussions about this. So we're moving it along and getting reports from the water board.
Yeah.
Well, should we have Joel? Do you feel like you can respond to some of that, because it's kind of tying in budget and just kind of future planning?
As we work, I don't know what dinged there. It wasn't me. That's fine. As we work forward the budget process and with the water board, as Ken gets his studies final phases done, and we have time to review those, we want to push these through and get the water savings and the water. My mind is blank. Not savings.
Water budget.
No, the
Conservation board.
Conservation. Thank you. get the water conservation going as we do the budget, and that's the stuff we can do first. And so we need to get the conservation going, save the water that we can in the short frame, and budget towards doing the studies and what we need to do going forward as we get Ken's work and the state's work back, and we do the water plan going forward. And then that way we can start working towards those policies that Mike and the council is looking for. So it's just a multi-year plan, and I think Kalen hit it on the head when he said we need to be conserving now and working towards those policies and plans long term.
And I guess just one other tool I'm looking through in case one of us comes across it as we go is, I think we all know we have some residents, who just go out of their way to use a very small amount of water. And I'm always looking for equity tools, but sometimes, if you want, say, everybody to cut across the board, it's kind of an unrealistic ask. If you have someone who's using a ton of water, it makes sense for them to cut. But if you have someone who's barely using any, they're in a lot less to take out. So I'm not saying we're going in that direction, but anyway, any tools that help with that as we go are useful too.
Yeah, the conservation can take on so many different ways. Obviously, using water to water our yards is a problem, but the commercial use of it is huge. And the water that we use, put out through public works, through the spigot loading all the trucks. I mean, any way we can get people to use less water through price rates, through once you start getting over certain gallon limits, to get them to reduce their use on commercial use as well. Like there's all different ways and different policies we can go forward. And
yeah, and I won't go in the weeds here, but I mean, I think we're definitely a community that values, people who garden and grow their own food. So we don't want to take away people's ability to do that either, but I'll shut up now.
One thing I was going to say around conservation, and Ronnie, I think you kind of speak to this, is that there are residents that also, I think, would say that they are concerned about growth and water availability, and yet they would also say, but don't make me conserve, or don't put any limits, because I don't want conservation to mask future development. And so if we are going to look, and maybe Carly, you can help us figure out this balance. If we're going to be looking at water conservation efforts, how do we do them in a way that doesn't just signal we're conserving water because we want to develop? Because I think what we're saying is that we want to conserve water so that we have, for those that are here right now, the vested interest today continues to have water available.
Yeah, you mean like framing the conservation as a resiliency tool rather than a development tool?
Well,
resiliency,
it's about framing, but it's also about making sure that we don't, so it's like a messaging, but it's also an actual action of we're not conserving today for development tomorrow. That somehow, can you cap is there a way to legitimize that promise for those that are concerned about conservation conservation might lead to development?
I'm going to answer very vaguely, because it gets complicated. It depends on the details of the conservation. And for any of these policies, there's this broad sort of concept that, yeah, you can regulate water use in your jurisdiction, but when it comes to the details, it very much matters what that actually looks like. And, you run into any sort of development caps or those kinds of discussions, you start running up against constitutional issues, like equal protection issues, takings issues, due process issues. So it's definitely worth the discussion, because I want to understand more like the goal, like clearly define the goal. And then we start maybe shaping the policy around it. But there's just a lot to consider, and let's talk about it.
Just to kind of summarize what I was saying too, is that there's fear that in the city we do all of these conservation efforts, and I've heard from commissioner from San Juan County well, you'll just use Colorado River water. If we get to that point, the city you're the closest, you'll just use Colorado River water. So it's like, because you've got the rights anyway. So it's like, whoa, this is tangled. And so we don't want to ever, I like your, you know, use of the word resiliency, because I think that that really is what we're looking for, is community resiliency. But we are going to have to be real careful how we message conservation, that it doesn't feel like a bait and switch for future development.
Yeah, so Mayor, let me point out one thing about San Juan County. Yeah, they can get it out of the Colorado River, but my understanding is that they would really, really rather not, because it's horrendously expensive. All right, they got to have to build infrastructure, pipelines, and bridges to span ravines in the whole 9 yards and bring it way uphill from the river, and they got to pump it. So Chuck knows all too, and Levi know all too well about the expenses of having to pump water. So they could do it, sure, and they might if they get enough money, but it's not going to be easy.
And we're seeing conversations right now about the Lake Powell pipeline. So easy or not, people are engineering their way into it. So we don't ever want to get to that place where we've overdeveloped to where we are now forced to look outside of our safe yield of quality water. Right? So Ronnie, you were done, correct? We do have Karen, so I wanted to give Karen a chance to talk as well. And we're right at 2 o'clock. So if it's okay, can we allow just a few extra minutes? I know, Kaylin, you said you had a hard stop, but Karen, do you want to just share any thoughts you have right now?
Just real quick. So obviously, you know, increased population, failing in infrastructure, increased temperature warming. This is all set our desire to be really ahead of this curve, instead of, you know, Emily, like you're saying, like waiting until, you know, we have to have discussions about the Colorado River. And I'm just, you know, this has been a long process, and I know there's a lot more work to be done, but Chuck or Carly, Mike, I mean, do we have an idea of when we will get to that like a sense of comfort of knowing what our safe yield is? I mean, are we, you know, still looking at 3 years from now, or, I mean, could it be sooner, you know, sooner than that? I'm just curious.
May I answer that very quickly, Mayor?
Yes, please. Yes.
Yeah, well, I think it could be quick, all right, because all the science is already in that supports whatever it is. All that's really left to do is to take a bunch of scientists, all right, and get them all in the same room with all their reports and data and research behind them, and thrash it out and come to an agreement. I mean, unless DWR thinks, oh, we don't know, we don't begin to know enough to even make a stab at putting safe yield, I suppose that they could, then you could come up with a number relatively soon. I would like to have a number that they have some certainty in, and then continue to do research and then modify that number later on if that's what the science says.
And Carly and Chuck, do you guys feel comfortable with that?
I guess I would say that I think within a year, we could have a number that wasn't necessarily sanctioned by DWR through, if they go through a groundwater management plan, but if we, you know, worked cooperatively, which we're doing, we'll continue to do so with everyone, we could hash it out, as Mike says, and come up with a number. And I think that myself, that's a reasonable time while we can be working on all the other things that Carly talked about. And Kayla, you know, conservation measures, policies and practices, low-hanging fruit that'll get, you know, while we get that number of safe yield, because ultimately that will be an important number. So that's my spin on it. I don't know if Carly has a different.
Agreed.
So we've got no more meetings 2020, and we've got a lot of information to digest along with our holiday meals in terms of meetings where we're going to be putting this on our agenda. So we've got a loose action plan for 2021. And I think it's pretty clear where this council wants to move forward in terms of our focus on water. I'm grateful to everybody coming through today to meet and talk about this. And unless there are any other burning questions or comments, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Thank you, Kaylin. Second.
All second.
Thank you, Ronnie. Thanks for everybody meeting today. All those in favor?
Aye. Thank you, everybody.
4-0. We are now adjourned. Thanks, everybody. Happy holidays. And see you tomorrow or Friday.